We're doing a series of lessons I'm calling the Treasury of David, and I'm pulling out certain Psalms that I believe that God has given special revelation to me from these particular Psalms. All of them are inspired, but these are the ones that speak so much to me. I want to look at the third Psalm. I'm going to call this a shield and sword. Psalm 3, verse 1. Lord, how have they increased who trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many are they that say of me, there is no help for him in God. Selah. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory and the one who lifts up my head. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. Selah. I laid down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. Selah. This particular psalm comes out of the life of David in one of those difficult times in life. I'm simply calling it our sword and shield. And that's what God wants to be for us. Not only does he want to protect us, he wants to defend us. And so the psalmist is discussing this. The truth is, it doesn't get any worse than this. This is a psalm of David when he is fleeing from his son Absalom. Wow, what a tragic story. Absalom is King David's son. He's trying to kill him, to kill his own father. Well, you would think you were reading something out of a newspaper, wouldn't you? No, that's been human nature all along. He's trying to take David's throne for himself, trying to overthrow his father, and of course, in the process, he has to kill him. Wow. As I said, it doesn't get any worse than this. This is probably the worst day in David's life. My. And then you think you have problems. I think I have problems. We have nothing to complain about, friend. This man is facing one of the greatest obstacles any person could ever face. Now, this is what we would call a lose-lose situation. You want to try to avoid them if all possible. If you can, set up as many win-wins as you can, that not only you win, but they also win. And if you can't do that, then at least make it a win-lose where somebody's getting something good out of it. But this is a lose-lose situation. For instance, if David wins this battle, he's going to lose his son. It's going to be over. His son's going to die. If David loses this battle, he will lose his own life. It's a lose-lose situation. Tragic, very, very tragic. And particularly when you think back that this is his own son. David had given life to this young man. If it wasn't for David, Absalom wouldn't even be here. And then the throne that they're coveting, David is the one that built this palace. David is the one that built this kingdom, the kingdom that they now covet and want to take for themselves. Now, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here describing this, but what a tragic story. What this story illustrates, as clearly as anything in the Bible, the fickleness of human nature. There is no doubt about it. Absalom is inspired of hell. It's the devil that has put this kind of hatred in his heart, just like Judas betraying Jesus. That's what this young man is doing to his own father. And so that's what this story illustrates. Now, going back to David. David and his people are in extreme danger. David has learned that Absalom has brought together an army in Hebron, which is only about 20 miles away, a very short distance away. He's brought together an army that could number up to 200,000 men. There are thousands and thousands. David doesn't know how many, but there are thousands of people that have gathered together with Absalom in his army to come to Jerusalem and to kill David and take the throne for himself. So it's an extremely dangerous situation. Good leaders, godly leaders, always think about their people and not themselves. That's always a sign of maturity. That's always a sign of love. It's always a sign of a good leader. And that's what David is doing. David is not thinking about himself in this situation. He's thinking about his people. And so, to avoid the bloodshed of a civil war, if he stays in Jerusalem, even if it's possible for him to successfully defend it, there's going to be thousands of innocent people that are going to die. And he knows that. And so what David does, he makes the choice to flee. It's not that he is a coward. He's not a coward. We know from the life of David, this is a very valiant man, a very brave, courageous man. Now, sometimes the best thing you can do is back off and recoup and reevaluate the situation. What's my next move? What's the wise thing to do? And so that's what he does. So David leaves Jerusalem and he takes a small group of people with him. There's a few hundred people that went with David, but it's not a large war party. It's a smaller group. And they're fleeing into the wilderness. Why? To avoid civil war and to keep innocent people from dying. That's what David's doing. Now let me divide this psalm into three parts. Three parts. You notice that 3 times the word Selah is used. It's a good break in this psalm. The word Selah actually is a musical notation. It's like a sustained pedal on a piano where you hold the note and just let it linger for a while. And it literally means, let's stop and think about that. It's a pause in the music. And so let's look at these 3 different places where he says we need to stop and think about this. The first one is what I will call trouble. Trouble. This trouble. The rebellion has been brewing for a long time. It's been going on for several years now. It goes all the way back to David's sin. David himself. It was his own sin, the sin where lusting after another man's wife, and he takes Bathsheba for his wife, has her husband killed in battle, and you know the Swordridge story. It's a tragic, tragic story. But that was planting the seeds of this rebellion that he's now facing. This insurrection that has risen against him, it comes back to David's own sin. He's the one that planted the seeds that produced this rebellion that he's now facing. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this is because at this point, what do you sense? Nothing but guilt. And that's what David is having to deal with. The guilt. And the devil's going to make sure of this. The devil plays mind games with all of us. So when we've done things wrong that have set up a scenario, a bad scene like this, it's crushing. See, it's always harder for us to believe God when we know we are at fault, that we did something wrong to set it up. And so it's one of the things that makes this psalm so outstanding, is to see what David does when this crushing guilt has come upon him and he realizes, I'm the one that started this mess. I'm the one that set this thing up. Notice how he responds. At point A, I would call it David takes his problem to God. That's the way he begins the song. He begins by saying, Lord. He begins by calling on God. And I encourage you, no matter what your situation is that you are facing, the best thing you can do with your problem is take it to God. Call up on God. That's what he does. Lord, how are they increased that rise up against me? Begin by crying out to God. That's the very best response to these problems. Thank God David did that. Thank God. And he shows us the right thing to do when we are facing a lose-lose situation. When no matter what we do, it's going to be wrong. It doesn't matter what we do, it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to work out the way we want it to work out. The best thing you can do is give it to God. And that's what David does here. Second thing, point B, I would say, David names his problem, but not his enemies. Now listen to that closely. Because what we are tempted to do when people rise up against us is attack the people. Start calling names. David doesn't do that. He talks about his trouble. He talks about his problem. But he doesn't say one thing about his son or the man that used to be his friend. His son Absalom, and I've already discussed Absalom, but then David's best friend was a man by the name of Ahithophel. And when you go back and research the story, you find out Ahithophel literally was the grandfather of Bathsheba. So you see the connection there, why that this man is so bitter and why he hates David so much is because of what David did to his family. He never forgave him for that. But notice what David does. He names the problem, but he does not name the people. Now, I encourage you to do that because focusing on people is a mistake. It's a mistake. The people, they're really not the problem. The problem goes back to the sin. The sin. And David realizes that. And so he doesn't start calling names. He just takes the problem to God. What wisdom there is in these words. Now before I want to leave this part about trouble, I want to point out something here. David's enemies literally believed God was on their side. Now, that's strange, isn't it? I've seen people that, are making terrible choices, but they think they're doing God's will. People that are doing terrible things. Remember where Jesus said, there will come a day when people will kill you and think they are doing God's service. Boy, I've seen those things happen. That people think they are serving God. And so this is what they say. He said, many are they that say of me, there is no help for him in God. In other words, he's a terrible sinner. He's getting what he deserved, and we're going to execute the justice of God in this situation. How confused can you be? But that's the way it was. Now, you've got to understand that many times people will accuse you of what they are guilty. They will put that on you, and they will say, I'm God's servant. I'm just as good a Christian as you are. Have you ever heard those words? And then the next words that come out of their mouth is just full of venom and poison. I mean, it's not God. That's what's happening in this situation. That's what David is having to deal with. And so what does David do? See, we must be secure in our relationship with God. Going back to David's life, this is years before when David had sinned, because David had truly repented for his sin. And he really did. We'll study that in another psalm, but he truly had repented for what he had done. Because of that, he's secure in his relationship with God. He knows God has forgiven him. Now listen to me, friend. All of us have made mistakes. All of us have sinned and done things that we should not have done, said things we should not have said. All we can do is ask forgiveness. And when we do, the Bible is very clear about this. Jesus said it. He that comes to me, I will in no wise cast him out. You come to Jesus, he's going to receive you. He's going to accept you. He's going to forgive you. Now, the sad part is some people don't do that. They refuse to do that. But David knew God had forgiven him. And it doesn't matter what people say about me. They can say that God is my enemy. They can say that God's not going to help me. But it doesn't matter what they say, because I know that God has forgiven me. The second thing that I want to talk about in this psalm is what I'm going to call trust. Trust. We talked about the trouble. Let's talk about trust. Point A, God is our refuge during times of trouble. Now, what the devil wants to do is to separate us from God. So when the time of trouble comes, he wants us to run away from God rather than running to God. It's a mistake to run away. Run to God. And this is what David does. Allow God to become your defense. Now listen to me carefully. God cannot defend you as long as you're trying to defend yourself. Put down your sword and back off. Give it to God. Stop fighting and struggling so hard. Allow God to become your defense. And so this is why he cries unto the Lord. He said, I will cry unto God. And he said, God will answer me. And the discovery that he makes is God becomes his shield. Note that in verse 3. But you, speaking about God, you, O Lord, are a shield for me. And that's where I get the name of this psalm, shield. A shield. Allow God to become your defense. Allow God to defend you. You are a shield for me. Now, the second thing, point B, is when we call upon God, our petition quickly turns to praise. Now, that is significant because praise is the language of faith, and God responds to our faith. So David begins to cry out to God, and notice what he says at the end of verse 3, you are my glory and the one who lifts up my head. Now, don't forget, we're talking about the worst day in David's life. We're talking about his own son is trying to kill him and take the throne. But what a surprise! When he turns to God and begins to cry out to God, soon praise bursts forth in his spirit. He finds himself praising God, and it lifts us out of our despair to the throne of God. That's one of the reasons why it is so important for us to come to God's house for worship. I've come so many times, just dragging my feet. I could barely get through the door, but I knew if I could just get in the presence of God, everything's going to be okay. See, I put it like this. How can we stay down when we are worshiping one that is so high? One that's up so much. The Most High God. There's something about when you begin worshiping God, you have to look up. That's why I say I love mountains. I just delight in mountains. Why? I like anything that makes me look up. Look up. And praise does that for us. As we begin praising God, we find ourselves looking up. the worst day of his life, and David is worshiping. He's praising God, who is my glory and the one who lifts up my head. You would have thought he was in some kind of great convention here, surrounded with hundreds and thousands of believers, rather than hiding in a cave out in the wilderness with his son trying to kill him. My, what a wonderful, wonderful story. Now, look at the third part of the psalm. The third part's what I will call triumph. Triumph. Because only God can take a problem like this and turn it into something good. Only God can do it. One of my favorite scriptures in all the Bible is Romans 8:28. And I would encourage you to memorize this verse, say it often. It's excellent. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord, to those who are called according to his purpose. When you begin worshiping God, you will soon find yourself in the presence of God. And here's the first point I want to make concerning triumph. Point A, God gives us rest in the midst of the storm. Listen to what the words that David says. Remember, this is the worst day, worst night of his life. Verse 5, I laid down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. Some of you worrying, fretting, and I'm not pointing fingers at anybody because I've done this myself. Lay there and toss and turn and try to figure out, what am I going to do? What's the answer to this? And listen to what David says on the worst night of his life. I lay down and slept. I awoke. In other words, God gave him rest. God gave him peace in the midst of his trouble. God's no favorites. God doesn't have favorite children. God loves all his children. And what God did for David, God will do for you, for me, if we will simply trust him. So God refreshes him on the worst night of his life. Another statement I will make here. Fear is a choice. It's a choice. Listen to what he says. This is verse 6. David said, I will not be afraid. Notice what he said. It's my choice. I will not be afraid. I make that choice. I'm not going to do it. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Now, the truth of it is, David doesn't even know how many people have joined Absalom's army. And that's why he says 10,000s, plural there. Because he doesn't know how many is in this army that's coming right now, marching toward him to come and kill him. And yet he says, I make the choice. I'm going to trust God. Wow. What amazing words. This man had an amazing relationship with God. He doesn't know, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You know why? Because God is my shield. God is my refuge. God is the one that's going to protect me. So it doesn't matter if there's 1, if there's 10, if there's 1,000, if there's 100,000. Because God is the one that's going to take care of me. But the truth is, and this is what he discovers in this psalm, remember, he's writing by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. God is more than just a shield. God is also a sword. And it's why I call this a shield and sword. He goes on in verse 7 to say, and this is the second point I want to make here under triumph. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Wow. This man is now inspired to write about victory, of what God is going to do in his behalf. That God is more than a shield for me. God is the one that is going to take up my battle. And when you read the story, that's literally what happens. See, the truth of it is, friend, God is not playing games. And what Absalom was doing was very deadly. It could have cost David his life if David had not had a good relationship with God, but it ends up being a double-edged sword, and it cost Absalom his life. Because God is not playing games with us. When God arises, He breaks the power of wickedness. It's always an awesome thing to see God do that. It's a fearful thing to see it. And you stand back in awe and say, how great God is. How mighty God is. He breaks the teeth of the ungodly in pieces. And so in verse 8 he says, salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. Do you hear what he's saying here? This psalm, which began in despair, is ending in praise, in worship. This psalm, the psalm which began in trouble, ends in blessing. The worst day of his life, the worst night of his life, and God has turned it around for him. And that's literally what happens if you read the end of the story. Absalom is dead and David is reinstated on his throne again. My friend, if God can do it for David on the worst day of his life, God can do it for you, for me, if we will simply take our problems to God and trust Him. So may God bless you in your Christian journey, and you learn that God is both a shield and a sword. All right.